G'day and welcome back to Ancient Wales, where we discuss Wales of the Iron Age. So we're now on episode 5, Religion, Myth, and Ritual in the Iron Age. Now, previously I've talked a bit about all of this in earlier episodes, but I wanted to revisit this because I think there's a lot that has been discovered about these periods, and as well, there is much more to add on to it. I will say from the outset, this is a very difficult topic to talk about, not because it's awkward or hard to talk about because it has mature language or whatever, whatever you want to call it, but rather it's hard because we don't have proper evidence. We know that religion played a crucial role in the Iron Age society. This episode will explore what we believe are some of the spiritual beliefs, rituals, and burial practices from the time. It will not be a listing of the gods of Britain of the Iron Age. That's an impossibility, and we'll kind of explain why as we go through this episode, but it's something to understand that it's not as simple as going, oh, well, this god's this god and this god's that god. It's not as clear as that. Iron Age Britain was home to diverse tribal societies with deeply rooted spiritual practices. Unlike modern organized religion with fixed doctrines, Iron Age belief systems were fluid, animistic, and polytheistic. The natural world played a central role in religious thought, and with trees, rivers, mountains, and animals often holding spiritual significance. Scholars believe that deities were linked to specific locations and worship was highly localized, as you can imagine. We know of some Iron Age gods or goddesses through later Roman inscriptions where local deities were often syncretized or mashed together with Roman ones. For instance, the goddess Brigantia, associated with rivers and sovereignty, was equated to Minerva. Archaeological finds such as torques, pony caps, and horns, such as Dumfries and Galloway, suggest that animal symbolism was integral to spiritual belief, possibly representing totems or divine messengers. While we have no surviving written records from Iron Age Britain itself, later Celtic myths recorded by medieval monks in Ireland and Wales, such as the Mabinogion, provide possible insights into earlier traditions. These texts contain motifs and supernatural beings, sacred kingships, and otherworldly beings which may reflect pre-Roman beliefs. We'll get into this a little bit later, but one recurring theme in these myths is the connection between human and supernatural realms. Figures such as the god Lugus, believed to be the precursor for the Irish Lugh, appear in both continental and insular traditions, indicating a widespread religious theme. Furthermore, legends surrounding Druids, the priestly class of the Celtic societies, suggest that they were key figures in maintaining oral traditions, performing rituals, and interpreting omens. Excavations across Britain have revealed a number of sites where it was likely used for religious purposes. Hill forts, lakes, springs, and groves appear to have been focal points for ritual activity. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from offerings deposited in watery locations, such as the River Thames, where weapons and human remains have often been recovered. One particularly famous site in Wales, Llyn Cerrig Bach in Anglesey, has a lake that has yielded an extraordinary array of objects, including swords, chariot fittings, animal bones, that suggested that high-value items were deliberately sacrificed to deities. Similarly, bog bodies found at Lindo Moss indicate that ritual human sacrifice may have been practiced in some circumstances, possibly linked to religious devotion, punishment, or prophecy. One of the reasons why we don't know much about this simply comes down to the fact that we know some people put into these bogs were done without their permission or possibly without their desire, or possibly they were in receipt of, shall we say, narcotics, which made them harder to deal with. And thus, in some cases, their hands are bound. And whether they were killed on site or carried there, that's another question we don't really know the answer to. But yet there is, this idea that we see of human sacrifice, something that will be played up on by people like Julius Caesar in later commentaries. The Druids were a powerful elite in Iron Age society, and they served, we believe, as religious leaders and legal authorities, as well as keepers of sacred knowledge. Classical writers, and here's why I say we believe, Romans interpreted what the Druids were. They were the ones reporting, and Julius Caesar was one of the first. And his interpretation is based on a very Roman centric idea. Druids may not have been how we see them in his writings. They may have been very different. It's hard to know because he's using his writings to justify his attitude and specifically to justify his wars. And so making these people seem mysterious and possibly, human sacrificers would make his war slightly more palatable because, of course, Romans, even though they loved to take slaves, weren't big on human sacrifice. And classical writers like him did interpret the Druids in the worst ways typically possible. They acknowledged, such as Julius Caesar did in his Commentary de Bello Gallico, or the commentary of the Gallic Wars, they were described, these Druids, as intermediaries between God and humans, performing complex ceremonies and overseeing sacrifices, something which would be very similar to what was going on in Rome. This is why I say you have to take these things with a bit of a grain of salt, because that's what Roman religious people did. That doesn't necessarily mean this is what these people did. Much like how there is a debate in anthropology and archaeology between labeling Druids as shamanic types or shamans, because that's an interpretation that comes from Aboriginal peoples in various locations outside of this part of Europe. And there is this concept that may not be something we should be comparing the Druids to, that they may be more formalized than that. They may be different than that. But I would counter that by saying, I don't think that the idea of having an elder who happens to have what's perceived as magical powers or a lot of experience and knowledge of medical practices as being that different between cultures. I think that's a commonality in culture rather than something we should separate and say, well, this culture did that, but this culture did something slightly different, so thus it can't be the same thing. I think the idea of Druids as being that image of education and learning, who have vast knowledge of spells and magical ideals, certainly crosses boundaries in other cultures. I don't think it's that different than many of the ways that priests and monks and other people are treated throughout the centuries before the modern era, wherein they are given magical powers and seem to wield power and understanding in ways that the rest of us didn't understand. That's not a criticism. It's just, I would counter the arguments that are being made on that front. But that's just me. Your mileage and ideas on this may vary. So don't get me wrong, just because I'm saying it doesn't make it right. But that's my own perspective on it. Now, Caesar also notes that Druids apparently forbade the use of writing for religious matters. I don't know about this one, and that they ensured that their teachings remained exclusively oral because that having that memory and expanding on that memory helped that person retain knowledge in their mind rather than wasting it literally by writing it down. I think that is hokum. I think that there may be some truth to that to a degree, but I believe that's only in the continental degree. I don't think in Britain that's the same thing. I think the Druids of Britain are dealing with a culture that is very much non-literate. There is no evidence before the Romans arrive of any writing of any variety or type. in any fashion done in Britain. We just have not found any of it. Now, could there still be some found at some point? Possibly. But for now, we don't even have what would be pictographic descriptional type images. We just don't have any relationship to that. So I think if you look at it from the British context, I think it's very hard to argue that, oh, the Druids were secretive and they hid things because of this, that, the other. And that's why, this explained them. Well, if that's the case, then why are there writings of Celtic writing that's Greek in its alphabet, but Celtic in its actual language being used in places like Portugal and in Gaul or France? And that shows that there is some literacy going on, even if it's not widespread. So, but that's not Britain. Britain is not that. There is no evidence of that. So I think that argument, at least from specifically the British Islands, is not really a great one. And I think it doesn't mean anything, really. Iron Age rituals ranged from everyday devotional acts to grand communal ceremonies. Evidence suggests that feasting played a crucial role in religious gatherings and reinforced social cohesion and invoked divine favor. Animal bones are often found in ritual contexts, such as at Danbury Hill Fort, where it indicated that livestock were sacrificed and consumed in ceremonial settings. For example, often in roundhouse development, one of the things they will find in the post holes is evidence of animal parts being buried in the post hole, sort of as a symbol to the gods of possibly, and everything from here on out is a possibly, of the divine acceptance of this place, the dedication of the house toward the gods. All of that may have something to do with it. We don't fundamentally know. So, and I'm going to continue to go back to that. And I'm sorry I continue to bring that up, but I think it's good to understand that these are educated guesses, not educated knowledge, really, based on other evidences that we have. A part of sacred ceremonies, one might even say a key reason for them, was found in birth and death. Both would be seen as associated between key events taking place of significance to a person. And these kind of events, of course, even today remain highly built up in ritual and in functional things. We think about, how we have gifting for births, how we have meals generally built up around deaths, and how funerals work and how the ceremony around a funeral works. Even if they're not religious, there's still a basis of religiosity in the ceremonies that quite often take place. So all of that needs to be understood in that context. We lay flowers quite often at the burial site of someone significant to us. Obviously, that is symbolic and it works in a very similar way. It doesn't mean that we're mystically hoping that the ancient, that person who's passed away suddenly gets a flower in the afterlife, but it's rather this concept of linkage between that person and you. And I think that's the same for the ancients. They aren't that different from us, let's be honest, and they may look at things in a different way. They may understand the world around them differently. But the reality is a lot of that is similar to our viewpoint. They want to have success. They want to have everything go well. And so acknowledging that through celebration and through feasting and through burials that are done in a certain way, in a certain method, that's a part of that process. Now, let's talk about what these burials would be like. Now, I say burial. The irony here is the first thing we're going to talk about is not a burial. It's what's called an excarnation, or a practice where you expose human remains to the elements before being placed in some form of burial or cremation or into a kist, if you want to use the example there. So effectively, the person is left out on a dais, and during the time period that they're left out there, the skeleton will be what's left over. Everything else will decompose through natural function. And then the bones are taken and they're either buried or cremated or, whatever they do with them afterwards. Now, why do they do that? Well, something that's been thought to be the case is there is a suggestion that it's an opportunity for the soul to escape the body through the destruction of the physical body. The soul then escapes. And in estimations of what we think happens, we perceive that this is all about escaping upward. You know, the soul escapes above into the sky and into heaven, using a more modern phrasing, whereas burials would refer to putting that person closer to the underworld or the place where the dead go. And thinking of underworld, don't think of it as hell in the way we consider it, but rather the idea that they would go under the ground because that would put them closer to the place where their soul would eventually go to live whatever happens to it after that. And quite frequently, that's kind of the two options that come about in the Iron Age. And we see throughout this period a reusing and reworking of Bronze Age burial mounds, especially with cremations, where you find people buried across centuries in those sites. And so some of them can get dotted with various burials. And likely that's because there's a relationship to them, possibly. Or it could be the significance of people finding these sites and seeing in them a historical concept. In other words, basically, there's an understanding they're important, that they're significant, that they're sacred in some way without necessarily understanding why. And so they reuse them. We find this happening in the Roman era when there are still coin deposits being done near them. In other words, you know, giving offerings to the ancient gods of Britain to watch over them while they're on their way, or the ancestors that were buried there. So there's still this concept of these sites as being holy places and explanations being given for their reason for being, much like how Stonehenge goes from being built by Stone Age Neolithic people who are honoring the dead in some form or fashion, and it eventually becomes, you know, it was built by giants and all of the stories that would come about because of that, or built by the, you know, the first ancestors that came from Troy to Britain, and you know, misunderstandings of the age of things because you don't, you know, have modern dating methods, so you just make an assumption that very old means not that long back. And so these kind of explanations kind of work themselves into the modern understanding, but the modern to them understanding of what the places are. And so they still remain significant to them. Same way hill forts remain significant even after the Roman period. And as well, the disposition of goods in graves, such as at Wetwang in East Yorkshire, imply that there was a belief in an afterlife where material possessions had value. We mentioned previously when talking about warrior classes, the burials would happen with swords, but we've also found necklaces, torques, beer, and food, as well as chariots and horses being buried in these graves, likely to help give comfort to the dead and to link them to the living. One of a story my own personal life was when I was a very small child. My father had bought a 1972 Oldsmobile, and he very much loved that vehicle. Loved it. He drove it till it basically was just about to break down. And he loved it so much that I remember my oldest brother saying at one time that he thought he would bury him in it because it had made such a significance to his life that it was a way to remember one of his favorite things. Is that very different than somebody who's buried with their favorite toy or their favorite necklace or jewelry or whatever, or their favorite pet, maybe, who may have passed on earlier? Who knows? All of these things kind of are what they did in those days. And we make guesses based on what we see now, which is, and what we know of in literate societies where things were copied down, say in Egypt or in Rome or in Greece and in Mesopotamia and areas like that, where they talk about these things and you kind of come to an understanding of, okay, this is probably why they're doing this, even if we don't know for sure. We talked a little bit about the bog bodies, and This is the most striking evidence of ritual practice in Iron Age Britain. These naturally preserved human remains, often found in peat bogs, show signs of violent deaths, as I said, including things like strangulation, stabbing, and blunt force trauma. Scholars suggest that these individuals may have been sacrificed and their bodies then placed in the bog as an offering to the gods as part of a complex rite of kingship and renewal. The preservation of soft tissue and hair in these bog bodies, such as the famous Lindo man, have provided invaluable insights into the health, diet, and cultural practices of the Iron Age communities, including the idea that what they ate before they were killed was that given to them specifically, in some cases, as kind of a last rites meal. And even though these are violently killed people, are they war captured? Are they slaves? Are they people who voluntarily wanted to honor the gods by sacrificing themselves effectively? We don't know for sure. We just make assumptions based again on what we see with other groups, and any one of those things could be possible, though the violent death side of it probably doesn't mean it was that wonderful to be a part of. And the reason why these bodies survive is because they're buried in water and muck where oxygen cannot reach them, and thus decay does not reach them because the microbes and things that you need in order to decay aren't there. And so they end up being pulled out thousands of years later in a mummified state. And unlike mummies in Egypt, they haven't had their organs pulled out, so they still have all of that to go with it. But it's very similar in that ideal. And it's not common, so don't get me wrong. This isn't like there are thousands of bog bodies floating around in bogs, just waiting to be discovered. But they did happen, and they were obviously a practice that was common enough and known enough that people would do it. Now, why were they doing it? That's the more difficult question to answer. Is sacrifices being done of humans because things are bad and it's a way to appease the angry gods? Is it a practice that's become ritualized on the victory in a war, much like what happened with Aztec captured war prisoners who are then sacrificed to the gods, and the blood of them that is used as an offering to these gods? There is all this kind of discussion, and we don't know the answers. Obviously, again, I will continue to refer to that, and unfortunately, this is an issue with literate and non-literate societies going back this far. You're just not going to understand everything. You're going to understand a few things. So keep that in mind. Small portions. And I'll try to not say it over and over again, but I'm going to go back to it a few times. I'm not going to lie. And while we think we understand what is going on, we still struggle to get to grips with something that's 2,500 years old as a practice, and it's done by people who are not literate, and they themselves never spoke of themselves, not in a way we would think of it. As Dr. Barry Cunliffe puts it, quote, "Human behavior seen through an archaeological record is seldom easy to understand with any degree of assurance," end quote. However, we can make judgments based on patterns, and returning to Dr. Cunliffe, quote, "A bronze sword dredged in a river could be a regrettable loss or a liberated deposition. A horse leg found at the bottom of a disused storage pit could be an offering to a god or the result of a casual disposal of waste," end quote. What tells us that they are different from being just casually lost items or accidentally lost items or things thrown out is that you just keep finding them. Another leg deposited the same way, sword after sword arising from lake beds or streams or rivers. The point is that these are not accidents. They're not carelessness, but practiced ideals. One that is likely has meaning and purpose, and shows that the offerings are based on how we see things done in other cultures and religions, where we do have written evidence of these practices. This is why we get the ideas that these are ceremonial and not just kind of what, this sword's slightly bent, let me throw it out. At two Welsh sites, for example, at Llyn Fawr in Glamorgan and Llyn Cerrig on Anglesey, these are two places where metal was placed at water sources. These locations are very different from each other, both geographically, one being in the far south, one being in the far north, but also in timing. Llyn Fawr happened at the beginning of the Iron Age, while Llyn Cerrig is at its end. Yet both show similar ideas of ritual deposits. Yet the distance in time also may point to a distance in what is perceived as the significance of why you're giving it to your god. In Llyn Fawr, for example, items that were offered were of martial use, such as spears and swords, but there was also non-martial things such as pots, scythes, and axe heads, to name just a few. These have been seen as votive offerings. Now, what is a votive offering? It's an offering or deposit which refers to the placement of one or more objects displayed or deposited without the intention of recovery or use in a sacred place for religious purpose. Such items are features of modern and ancient societies and generally made to gain favor with supernatural forces. As a modern example, think of rosary beads left in a Catholic church, or a candle lit to honor someone, or something like food and drink left at a Shinto shrine. We still do things similar to what these people did in our own modern religious worship today, but they're generally given and understood differently, yet they may have similar meaning, gaining the favor of the gods or the saints. We carry forward a lot from these ancient peoples, and it's something that I think is significant for us to understand. That we ourselves may not even recognize it, I would argue, is a definitive example of an idea that we are seeing, that we think we're so different from the ancient people, but actually we do a lot of things that are very similar to what ancient people did, just interpreted differently or understood differently. It's important to understand when we view these things done in the past that we give it context and understand that there is meaning and a way of doing things, as pointed out by Dr. Miranda Althouse Green, someone who's, I have to point out, a lot of the books that I found about Celtic and ancient Britain mythology come from her. I have 3 books, and I was mildly surprised to realize that she'd written them all, because I did not buy them knowing she'd written them all, so it's kind of interesting. But she said, water deposits of votive offerings gives us, quote, undoubtedly it reflects a highly ritualized action associated perhaps with episodic renewal of allegiance to a spirit power perceived as residing in these remote, liminal, dangerous, and inaccessible places such as pools and bogs, end quote. Another aspect of this myth building is, how do we understand the way that ancient Britons perceived their world? How can we glean any ideas on what they saw about their world and what likely might have been the purpose of some of their actions? Well, as I mentioned, we can perceive that they were making offerings to gods, but what would that look like? And what would their gods, in fact, look like? What would they seem to, and how would they be perceived to be? Were they human or animal or something ill-defined like wind, weather, earth, or sky? That's a question that would be harder to pin down than burial practices or votive offerings, though we can get a clue from those. Modern historians and archaeologists try their best to interpret and understand the gods of Iron Age Britain through a number of ways. First, examining ancient and not so ancient, prehistoric and pre-literate people gives us an understanding of that they can view through a lens of how and what it is that they're answering. We know, for example, that ancient Hebrew/Canaanite people talked about their god as a god of storms or a storm god. We know others, such as the Cree of the Northern Plains in North America, saw the world riding on the back of a giant turtle and viewed their gods as personified through animals and spirits. Others, such as the Greeks and Romans, saw gods as human-like, while still having elemental natures, such as Zeus was the storm god, for example. We assume that ancient Britons worshipped and built near water sources, likely an idea of sacrificing for crop yields, successful wars, hunts, and any number of other meanings would explain some of these water deposits. Others revolved around the sky. One suggestion for the exposure of bodies, as I mentioned earlier, is to allow the spirit to return to the sky as it escaped the decaying corpse. Something that would make sense if you believe that freeing a trapped soul on this earth was key to the next life. And then in discussing other practices where burying and returning a body to Mother Earth and her children and offering safe passage through the form of the underworld through offering libations or riches, in other words, valuable items to trade while you go along the river Styx, for example. This would be similar to the Egyptian idea of the afterlife and why burials became so elaborate for the wealthy. And let's be clear, when we talk about elaborate burials, we are likely talking about higher class or possibly well-respected people, like an important elder or ancestor. So, who are the gods of this world? Can we make guesses? Now, I have seen a list of names, and I know there are names. They are lifted from medieval sources, so I'm not going to list them here. We've mentioned a couple previously, but there's a reason why I'm not mentioning them. But I want to talk about that in more depth. What we want to talk about is, rather than talking about specific names, we're going to talk about what the gods could be. Recently, for example, it's been noted that Iron Age Britons had some sort of respect for animals, and especially the ones that were new to the island. Around 500 BCE, for example, hares and chickens arrived as a major animal to the islands. This respect was so much so that they actually did not use them for food, apparently, until the Romans arrived around 500 years later. There were ditches where hares and chickens had been found buried whole, not taken apart the way you would if you were cooking them, as you would do for a chicken dinner. These were animals that could have been kept as pets, and thus their significance to these people meant that they were given honorable burials because of that. And this may be because of their relatively unusual appearance compared to other animals that existed at the time. Or could it possibly be that there was some sort of mysticism built up around them? Again, I will argue your guess is as good as mine, but there are suggestions that it may have been a mystical meaning as to why they were honored the way they were. One thing we do know is that the representation of the divine is incredibly difficult. Celtic-influenced art is often abstract at best. When carvings are found of heads in various parts of Wales, we aren't even sure their disposition happened. Were they from the Iron Age? Were they from Roman Britain? Or could they even be early medieval carvings that just happened at some point by somebody, and we just don't have enough evidence to be able to define when they happened? So while some would say they're definitely Iron Age, there's nothing else in any other part of Britain where that shows to be something that was done. So it makes it more difficult to work on that or come up with that. It also appears that personifications of deity was not really something done in Britain. If idols did not exist that captured the image of God, what exactly did they think their gods were? One suggestion could be ancestor worship, an idea that ancestors watch over their progeny from the other side is popular across many religions even today, so it makes sense that this might explain some of the reason why there's no obvious godlike figure. Animism, in other words, giving animals divine natures as either the gods themselves or more likely as divine messengers that watch over the people, is something, again, seen in religions such as dragons taking on godlike tendencies, for example, or the way cows are worshipped in places like India, or any number of other examples of various animals that are perceived, such as the white hart in Old English mythology, and how they are looked at. We do see carvings in pottery that show animals and their motifs, cats and cows, appear in several places, as well as iron fire dogs, which are found in various places, also show that there was some importance about them. significant enough to at least mark them. In earlier medieval stories, we often have mystical creatures, as I mentioned, the White Hart, or the horses that travel at massive speeds through the Mabinogion, the mythical creatures like nymphs and fairies that exist in forests and in different wild places, hiding themselves from humans to trap them or to give them rewards that are somewhat have strings attached kind of idea. The problem of these stories is that because they're of medieval origin, they might be holdovers from the Iron Age myths, but we have to tread carefully because there is between 600 to 1300 years separating them from when their supposed invention happened, which you can't just assume that one relates to the other. Take, for example, the Bishop of Myra in present day Turkey, who lived in the 3rd century CE. In one of his earliest stories, it was said that he had rescued 3 girls from being forced into prostitution by dropping sacks of gold through the window of their houses each night for 3 nights so their fathers could pay a dowry for each of them. In other words, marry them off rather than having them end up in prostitution. He would also be claimed to have attended the Council of Nicaea under Emperor Constantine, and though there is no record of this during the actual event. But nearly 2,000 years later, this man is said to wear a red suit, sit on a sleigh with 8 or 9 reindeer, delivering presents to the world's children on Christ Mass Eve. So our understanding of Saint Nicholas has changed. Our descriptions of him has changed. No longer is he known as a Roman bishop to the majority of the population. He is instead a jolly red and white suited elf in Coca-Cola colors who flies around in the most northern of northern items and delivers presents not to, girls going into prostitution, but rather to the entire world's children. This is a very different understanding. And if that's changed when we have a literate population and the actual stories that were written about this bishop, hundreds and thousands of years ago, just imagine in a non-literate society how stories changed. So I would, I guess, point out that while we have lists of gods and lists of ideas, I don't think we can accept that one equals the other, that the stories in the Mabinogion, for example, link back to some ancient source. There's loads of examples of people creating things from whole cloth. Look at Iolo and his concept of druidism, which was completely made up, and how he tried to link it to ancient sources, somewhat like Geoffrey of Monmouth, who did similarly in the medieval period. These people are not trustworthy sources. And I think that the same could be said about oral traditions that are being passed down in between various changes to society in ways that just don't carry on correctly. So while I am saying this, I just want you to understand that, yes, we have evidence of things that are going on, but you can't say, oh, yeah, that's definitely Lu, the god of this, the god of that, or whatever. You can say that. It doesn't mean anything. What is presumed based on pretty good guesses is that, as I mentioned, water sources were very important to Iron Age Brits. They would offer sacrifices to them of various kinds, and it was a widespread practice, so culturally important enough to reach all parts of the island and beyond. So why do we have no evidence or shrines of religious practices? Well, consider the fact that likely any sort of sacred site to an Iron Age Brit by the time the Romans arrive is still a sacred site to an Iron Age Briton, now called a Roman Briton. And the Romans, or at least their Roman British people, will then create a Romanized temple on the site. And it still becomes an important site. It's still a significant site. We still have sites in the Roman period that will have water deposits of curses and blessing requests and everything else being sent to the gods who have some linkage of themselves back to both Roman and Celtic sources. But at the same time, that then ends up later, Roman British Christians, understanding that the site is holy, dedicate it to their God, build a church upon it, and then it represents their faith, but also removes the previous shrine. And a shrine that's made of marble or of stone will leave usually an evidence in the record when people excavate later. However, a wood structure, which is more likely in the Iron Age, is not going to be left over. Mostly what we find of wood structures in the Iron Age is typically what we call post holes. So in other words, the remnants of the holes created by the posts that were dropped into the ground. And that's not a lot of evidence. And it's not easy to divine what's going on by that. So now encapsulate that by being it crushed under by buildings of marble or of stone, and then add to it a tearing down of that, and then putting up a whole new site with more stone or wood or a number of other things. And then along comes an Anglo-Saxon Christian who then says, we want our church there instead. They rip it down and they put their own version on. And then a Norman comes later and does the same thing. And you end up with a cathedral on top of what used to be just a little spring that people threw swords into. Now, the reason why we still find these Iron Age sites is because a lot of them were in the middle of nowhere, effectively, for both modern age people and ancient people, because they were difficult to get to. Obviously, you weren't always going to build sites there, especially in later dates. Thus, the reason why places like Bath, where you have an obvious Roman temple site, becomes an easy site to build a church on, because you have an obvious, location for that. But if you're talking somewhere in Snowdonia, which is in a mountain range, you're not necessarily going to have random church built there necessarily, because there isn't going to be the population to justify it. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think it's important for us to understand that. Caesar, in describing the gods of the Gauls, for example, the closest cultural neighbor of the Britons of the late Iron Age, was said that there were many and varied versions of gods, and that they were, to a degree, equivalent to the Roman pantheon, itself mostly lifted in a way from the early Greek pantheons. Their possible names could be found in Roman inscriptions around the northern parts of the empire from Germany to Britain, merged with their Roman equivalents, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. All along with this, let me now leave you, however, with the comments of Dr. Cunliffe, who said, quote, "The plethora of confusing deities falls into two groups. There are deities of place and deities of sky. The first are land-based and often associated with rivers and springs, and are usually female. The second are tribal gods, who are invariably male. And it is noted that the intermediaries in Caesar's perception for this are the Druids. One of the reasons I haven't gone into huge detail about the Druids in this episode is because we've done an episode on the Druids. If you want, you can listen back to that from 2016. But I may go through and re-listen and just see where I can add to that understanding later. But if we're going to talk about the Druids, I think we should talk about it closer to Roman Britain times, because that's where we really get our first sight of them. And I think interpreting anything before that is a fool's errand, because we can't know that the concept of a Druid, as understood by Julius Caesar and Tacitus and others who wrote in that time, Cicero, is the equivalent of what was going on later times or earlier time periods. There just may not be that example. It simply may be that the person who would play the role of a Druid in ancient tribal Britain was simply the elder of the local tribe, or the chief, or just a guy who could do a pretty good interpretation of things and had been relatively successful in the past. And so people went, well, you must be magical or mythical, and you may understand the gods better than we do. thus will rely on your perception of things. And the fact of the matter is, even though the Romans are obsessed with males being in charge and male domination, the father being the center of society, that's not the case in Iron Age Britain. We know that for a fact. There's loads of examples of that. And we'll discuss, in fact, when we get to Roman Britain, about how some of the early leaders of the resistance and the acceptance of Roman rule were women, and that they led their nations, their tribes, whatever you want to call them, in a way that's very similar to what the male figure would do in other societies, and how much that is obviously seen in that society depends on your point of view. And if your point of view is of a male dominated society, then the women don't get treated the same. And again, we'll discuss that when we get there. And with all that said and done, thank you all for listening or viewing today. I hope this was helpful. I hope it gives you some context about it. The other reason why I didn't want to mention names of gods specifically is because when we get to the Roman period, we will be discussing names in particular, specifically how they're interlinked to Roman gods like Minerva, like Poseidon, and all of those kind of gods, because they have Jupiter, because those linkages actually have meaning, they have purpose, and there's reasons why they're doing it. And I think it's important for us to understand that, and it'll give us at least some small understanding of these gods. But remember, likely these are gods of Roman Britain, not gods of Britain. And there may not be a relationship between, say, a Siluri's god and a Ordavantes god, or a Brigantes god, or, pick and choose what tribe we want to talk about. They don't necessarily worship the same thing or focus on the same thing. And it may or may not be like the Greeks, where the Greeks had a common pantheon, but different gods meant different things to different city-states. It may be more like the Middle East, where various tribes had their own set of pantheon, and the pantheons warred amongst themselves in the thought process of those local people. So with all that said and done, thank you all for listening and viewing. As I said, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on X, Blue Sky, or Instagram at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And hey, if you are curious or want to, you can also donate via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. That money, as I said a couple of weeks ago, will be something I am going to dedicate towards creating an opportunity to do video in Wales on various historical events and people and things like that. So, places. But that's for later. That's something, as I said, that's something I'm looking ahead to do. So from now on, thank you very much. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care. Enjoy. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.